Nice, thank you. Hey, welcome everybody to one of our, only had a few of these webinars so far, from the Swedish Wellbeing Hub. So for those who aren't aware, Wellbeing Economy Alliance is a global organization, and there are national hubs in not all countries, but many countries around the world. And we started the Swedish hub around September time, and had a few of these already, as well as a core team that's doing other activities. So we've had a previous webinar with Lisa from the Scotland hub, talking about the work they were doing there. And this time we've got Amanda Janoo from the Vermont hub in the United States. So we're very, very happy to have her come and share her wisdom with us. Maybe Anders wants to share a little bit about how you met for the first times. You muted, Anders. You need to unmute.
Well, Sia's going to tell a bit about the event when we very first met Amanda, but I was thinking of telling about the first time or when we met doing an interview with Amanda for a documentary that Sia and me are making. That was part of this project Scenario 2030. And that was in a friend's home of mine. And until then, I was still a bit unsure of what WEAll was all about. And I were a bit doubtful about the radicalness of WEAll Wellbeing Economy Alliance. And after a while during the interview, I understand much more of the broader picture that we all worked with. And I was very inspired, and I'm therefore very happy to have Amanda here now and share her thoughts with you. And I was really amazed of the broad perspective that Amanda had on these issues with how economy is influencing a lot, or as I see it, is the core of why we are lost when it comes to inequality, and not the least environment, and getting running out of resources, with both human and nature resources. So that was probably the moment when it in me happened that I came to be part of starting the Swedish hub. And Celia will tell about the event where we first met Amanda.
Well, yeah, we were planning an event with Scenario 2030 at the People's Forum that was part of, it was a side event to Stockholm Plus 50 last June. But then we saw in the schedule that there was this, that the WEAll were organizing an event that was like, it was almost as we had written the same description to our both events. So and they encouraged us, the organizer encouraged us to like see if we could collaborate with people. So we just emailed each other. I don't remember who started it, if I emailed or if it was maybe Lisa from Scotland, but we decided to, why not merge our sessions? Also because we were kind of lacking another person on the panel, so it was actually a perfect collaboration. And we started with having like we went out for dinner the first night, even before in Stockholm to meet each other. So yeah, I guess that was the start of getting a Swedish hub started in Sweden.
Nice. Maybe Amanda wants to speak a little bit about how she came to WEAll and what was the beginnings of everything.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for the beautiful introduction. It's really great to be with you all today. I'm in Vermont, but I know it's your evening over there. So good evening to everyone. My journey to WEAll, like the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, like I have to say for sure, it's like a dream job. When I started studying economics in university, I was really I was interested in understanding. I had this sense that there were a lot of political and cultural and spiritual and social and environmental issues, and that somewhere towards the center sat the economy. And so I was studying economics because I wanted to understand not just how the economy works, but how you transform it, and was really frustrated with my economics courses because, at least in the United States, it's very neoclassical, and it's tons of just insane kind of assumptions regarding our human nature and the way that economics and our world sort of functions, but all guised under a lot of regression analyses and quantitative methods that don't really allow you a lot of space to sort of explore and get to the roots of the thinking that sort of underpins that around us all being fairly selfish, greedy, individualistic sort of entities, or the fact that the earth, the natural world, is viewed as an externality in this thinking as opposed to the foundation of all of life. Just so many of these ideas. And so that led me down a path of trying to study more what we'd call heterodox economics, different sort of economic thinking and approaches. Did a lot of self-studying around the history of economic thought to understand where these ideas came from and in what context. And then by the end of university, I didn't really know a lot, but the one thing I knew was that neoliberalism was the worst, right? This idea that the government should take a hands-off approach to the economy and just allow the free market to guide us somehow to infinite prosperity seemed like a terrible idea. So I ended up working in international development for a long time as an economic policy expert, and specifically industrial policy, because that's sort of old school development policy where government is meant to strategically protect and promote certain economic activities relative to others. So proactively transform the structure of their economies as opposed to just open themselves up to the whim of the free market and then try to fix the damages later. And through that work, first of all, I realized how unjust our global economic system is, because even when there is very strong political will amongst lower income countries, they just don't have the space in order to do that sort of transformation. But also just there was always the implicit assumption that the goal is economic growth, and that's the only goal. And working in the space, I realized that the major value I could bring was just to ask the questions of, what are you really trying to achieve, right? What are you actually trying to achieve with this economic policy? And in some places it was the answer would be different, right? It would be inequality reduction or resilience or, peace in certain places, right? And the goals that we set really matter, because if Myanmar, for example, wanted to reduce rural-urban inequality reduction, then it doesn't make sense for them to follow the standard strategy of just attracting foreign multinationals to come in who know how to concentrate wealth better than anyone, right? It would make more sense for them to support smaller, rural, informal firms. Or if Mozambique was interested in supporting building greater resilience, doesn't make sense for them to specialize in raw material exports, right? But maybe really focus on building a diversified and locally embedded economy that could ensure that people have the basic needs that they have. And so that sort of naturally led me to the Wellbeing Economy Alliance or movement, because here was this whole community of people who were all asking the question, what's the purpose of the economy, right? What are we actually trying to achieve through our economies? And as logical and intuitive as that seems, it's a pretty big mind shift, because we've held the economy as superior for so long. that we still feel the need, for example, to make the case for why health is good for the economy, right? Like, as opposed to swapping that burden of proof and saying, how would we evaluate the economy in terms of its contribution to our health? Because obviously human life and health is superior to this sort of system of, abstract system of the economy. And so I work as their economics and policy lead now. I do a lot of trying to make new economic ideas and initiatives that we see as the foundations of this alternative economic system and paradigm more accessible. And also, because of my background, I work a lot with governments as well, thinking about systems of governance reform and policy design to sort of support that transition. But I'll leave it at that for now, and then we can get into more details later. But that's
great. Thank you, Amanda. You managed to do so much in what seems like a short amount of time. How many countries have you worked in?
Oh my goodness, that's a really good question, actually. A couple summers ago, my friend came and visited, and we were going through a list of at least the countries that I've spent significant time in, at least 3 weeks was our sort of criteria, and it was, I think, 57, maybe almost 60 countries. So I was moving around a lot for quite a long time, and now I'm back in Vermont where I grew up, and it's been some interesting reverse culture shock, but also a really wonderful opportunity to give back to where I'm from.
Yeah. So we prepared a few questions that we also put in the Facebook event for this, and a few people in the core team have thought about questions. So we thought these could frame this discussion a little bit, but definitely we want to keep it a free conversation as well. So unless people are speaking over each other, feel free to just kind of chip in, I guess, everyone, and then ask follow-up questions and so on. But we can start also raising hands, might be easier. But one of those questions was, how can we talk in kind of an engaging and constructive way about economic visions with people, so it doesn't become too abstract or far from those realities? I guess this is quite a complex question, and no one's got the whole answer to it, but it's something we were curious to hear your perspective.
So one of the things I think is significant was that, our founder, Stuart Wallace, he came from having led the New Economics Foundation. And when he came out of retirement to start WEAll, he really intentionally, I think, called it the Wellbeing Economy Alliance as opposed to economics. And I think this is significant, because economics is one thing, which is sort of the theory and study of the economy, but the economy is another, which is an aspect of life on this planet. And so often I think the two get conflated a lot, and economics comes with this whole other jargon and, certain kinds of associations of what that means and the way in which you need to sort of talk about it in order to be taken seriously. Whereas the economy, the way that I describe it, at least, is it's the way that we produce and provide for one another, right? It's an important aspect of life, but it is a means, right? It's methods and means by which we engage with one another in our natural environment to improve our collective quality of life. And I think by describing it in just those sort of simple terms, it helps people to remember that we are the economy, that we have the sort of power to design or redesign the system in whatever way we want. And that's really important, because otherwise, when we talk about economics, often it's presented as a pretty abstract external system that lives out there a little bit beyond our control. And also probably just because of the way that neoclassical economics has developed, it tends to be presented as a natural sort of phenomena that has its own self sort of regulating laws and systems that is also quite disempowering for people. So just even starting with discussions around what the economy is and what its purpose is, I think helps a lot of people to feel more confident to engage in those discussions.
I have a follow-up question to that. And that is something that still after decade is really unclear to me, is that it seems to me that economy is a quite absent matter in equality and environment engaged people in those issues. How can that be?
Mm-hmm.
If you even agree, I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm. No, I think it's a really important point. And I think, again, and I don't want to say that this is intentional, but I've had a little bit of suspicions that some of the economists have built this kind of ivory tower by which they make the economy seem so complicated and so jargon filled that people don't feel like it's too complex or boring for normal people to have an opinion on. But the thing is, it's also simultaneously presented as the most important consideration that trumps any other one, right? And so you're sort of stuck in this catch-22 of being like, okay, well, what's the economic costs of COVID, right? Or what are the, economic, it's too expensive to deal with climate change because it'll ruin our economies. And so it's always presenting the economy as if it's superior to any other consideration. And so therefore, I've noticed, at least, let's say, again, let's use the public health example. Because people are coming from public health, they know a lot about health, but they don't feel like they know a lot about economics. And so therefore end up feeling, right, trying to make the case using economic logic for why people's health is good for productivity. So therefore it's going to be good for the economy and for economic growth, right? As opposed to feeling like they can swap that burden and prove, right? And ask, okay, well, how would we assess which kind of economic activities and behaviors are positively contributing to our environment or to our, the health of people and planet? And I do think that a shift is coming. And I've even noticed this, for example, that the WHO has a theme, which is on commercial determinants of health, right? Like they're starting to think about, okay, well, how is the economy affecting this? And I think that it's because after the financial crisis, people already started to question quite a lot of the traditional economic thinking. But since COVID, people are just, they're not buying into it in the same way. I think there is an opening of people really questioning the traditional economic logic and arguments. And so I think this is a lot of what we can do within this community here, is that a lot of our work is helping to demystify the economy and helping people to feel more confident to engage in that discussion, right? And to challenge a lot of the conventional economic logic that dominates it.
Have you seen examples in the different national hubs and how they've tried to open this discussion? Like, have they, gone to different target groups, or do they tend to work using the same strategy or same economic models? Or
So I would say most hubs, broadly speaking, do have to start with this, demystifying the economy as the first step, right? So reminding people that we are the economy, that we can change it, that it's not given. Also expanding people's understanding of what the economy is. And so I don't know how it is in Sweden, but in the US, for example, when people think about the economy, they only think about business and finance, right? And that's their assumption of what we're talking about if we're talking about anything economic. But if you think about it as, okay, well, it's the way we're producing and providing for one another, you realize that some of that happens through business and finance, but a lot of that happens through public-oriented institutions like the government or academia or NGOs. And a lot of it also happens in households and communities and through non-monetary systems of exchange. And that all of it is really embedded in the natural environment. And so even just expanding people's understanding of what we're talking about here, and it can allow for a broader range of people to feel like they can find a home within these discussions and also get to the root causes of a lot of what they often care about already. And so, some of that demystification, I think the actual approaches to doing that have differed. So I think I was mentioning Ireland is doing, focusing a lot on art and culture as their sort of starting point for shifting narratives. And I've heard that you're also, taking, and I think that's so exciting. And I think that that's really important. A lot of it is also just have like one-on-one conversations, meeting people where they are. I think that happens a lot, going to events and sort of raising this sort of awareness. In the US, for example, I've been starting to try to speak with journalists, the ones who are already reporting on the economy in sort of a different way, to understand how they got there, to like sort of think about strategies for how we might be able to help reporters to report on the economy in a different way to help shift that sort of public narrative. I don't think we've all figured it out, but I think we're all trying different aims and seeing
Is
what
there a link
works.
to, there's this movement called solutions journalism.
Yeah.
Is it linked to that work?
Yeah. So the Solutions Journalist Network, well, we have one here, for example, who I think are a really great ally in that sense. And there was also a news sort of outlet called Shareable. And it was all about news reports on the sharing economy, right? And so also bringing examples of where we see that in our daily lives. And so there's quite a few different, but yeah, I think the Solutions Journalism Network is important because it also moves us from just focusing on problems to also having some real solutions for it, which I think is important in this day and age because it's easy to feel kind of overwhelmed. And yeah, we need some hope as well too.
Definitely. Does anyone else have a question before I start reading from this list? I'm sure there are a lot of people who'd want to ask Amanda.
I have a question that I was just thinking about, because when you talk about this, how we talk about the economy, and I find one thing that's like very like right now with the like all this inflation going on in the world, it's just, even though I'm even like working with these questions every day, like with trying to understand the economic system. I mean, I'm not an economist, of course, but like with doing this documentary, like I mean, I know quite a lot about these issues, but when it comes to inflation, every time it's like, I get so confused. Like I try to listen to a podcast and I'm like, so I was just wondering if there's a way that like WEAll is trying to like tap into this, because it's like it's being discussed so much now. Like, is there a way that we could like change the discussion around like inflation and how, because I feel like there's in that debate, it's only like a mainstream perspective, at least in Sweden, around in the like public debate. I feel like, yeah, there's really just one perspective almost being presented.
Yeah, I mean, so I'll share something a little more philosophical and then I'll share something very practical like this. Yeah. And so the first one is that inflation is fascinating because it became the boogeyman with Milton Friedman and the monetary like theorists. And so they really utilized inflation, and especially like the 70s sort of the oil crisis and the inflation sort of period as a strategic mechanism by which to try to undercut labor unions and worker rights, and to make the case that like workers and our salaries were fundamentally the problem, and unflexible labor markets and all of these things. So it was a strategic sort of avenue by which to really undercut a lot of worker power at the time. Now that's a more philosophical one, which I think is fascinating, because anytime inflation comes up, like even the US right now, it does talk a lot about this, like, oh, well, it's because wages are increasing too much. But one of the really, in the United States, for example, there's an organization called the Groundwork Collaborative that has done a really good job of really centering corporate profiteering as the major driver of inflation, as opposed to it being a worker's income, which is normally, or just talking about, Fed like interest rates and things like this, like the sort of money supply, which is maybe the other sort of dynamic that gets looked at here. And that argument has been quite compelling, and they've done a lot to try to push through the media that argument, because you had a moment where energy prices are rising, but ExxonMobil's profits are record, in history, right? And so you're seeing like immediate sort of correlations between the sectors where there's highest inflation and the profit margins. Now, I'll also say, and this is something I want to explore more as well, and maybe I don't know if it's the same where you are, but I would the housing costs, at least in the United States, account for 1/3 of the driver of inflation. Yeah, so at least in terms of the consumer price index. And most of the hubs, yeah, I know they're also in sort of a housing crisis where their cost of housing is really unaffordable. And housing as an entryway is really interesting because we don't want to talk about it, but once you start talking about it, you get to the issues of the financialization of basic needs, with the rentier economy, with the fundamental questions around property ownership. So you like bust open like a lot in terms of some of the failures with the current economic system. But you also, at least in in the United States, you start to look at why is it that it's so hard to make money off of your actual work, and it's a lot easier to make money off of passive income. And we sort of designed the system this way. And that's a lot of the reason also that people view homes as investments and things like this. But I'd love to hear how you've been hearing about it and what the framing of it is like in Sweden as well, where you have like a much stronger social sort of safety net and probably more of housing as like a human right. I don't know.
I have a question.
Can I just, before the next question, say that
Mhm.
it seems to me in Sweden that there's also a great absence of discussion of why home prices are rising so much. It's a lot of talk about how do I get a place to live and how can I afford this and that, but not the reason why.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I mean, spreading this information is absolutely crucial, but we have to face it that we have big business against us, and media is following big business. We have no chance. I mean, we must learn from history. We have no chance against corporate media and big business. So how do we achieve this system change in time? How?
Great question.
What?
Good luck, Amanda.
No, I mean, and I think it's a
No,
very
it's
fair.
to everyone. It's to
Yeah.
everyone. How do we achieve? I mean, this is the most important question.
Yeah. Sorry.
How do we achieve it?
I mean, I could kick us off, but I would welcome anybody else also to.
I have an idea. I think that we have so little time that the people have to take power. We have to bypass parliamentarism and everything and just take power, or else, I mean, we have a few years and we have to spread the insight that the people have to take power. That's all. So do we do that? Do we spread such an insight to people?
Want to respond to that, Anne? You had your hand raised.
It's not Amanda. It's to everyone.
Yeah, I know. It's just that Anne was raising her hand, so I think she wanted to respond directly to that.
Yeah, I've been thinking. I'm about 60 years old, and from the beginning, it was the engineers setting the goals for everything, the work. But around the 90s, then everything changed to economy, and we got in my company, ABB, ASEA, Brown Boveri, we got economist as the vice president. So everything turned in economy, and it's what we did was that we have follow-ups all the time about the economy. Everything was about economy. And I think we have, just in the opposite to our last Statsminister, Löfven, we cannot think in the future. We have to think backwards. What happened? How did we get here? Why is everything about economy? And I think economy actually is culture, because it it's about very much about work, work situations, study situations. You have to study a lot. In the European Union, you have to, they have a goal that 40% of everybody should have an academic degree. That means that you have to study a lot, and you can put people into study. I think it's a great idea that you change and you study all life. But if you have to study very long, you kind of put people into studying instead of working. And if you go for a job today, you might get not, as we want, 100% employment. You get kind of 60%, and you can't live on it. So everything is about culture becomes economy, and economy becomes culture. And I think we have to go back to Milton Friedman and start to question, because now we see the result of Milton Friedman's ideas. And we see it in social problems, we see it in economical problems, and we see it in ecological problems. So that's how I have been thinking. So we don't do like Löfven, we don't talk about the future only, we have to look backwards. How did we get here? And then that's why we are here with all these problems. And I think that Sweden have to cope with this, just as every country have to cope with it. But then it's a lovely idea that we can share our ideas with all the other hubs. Just like you're not alone. We have to do the same. The same thing has happened globally. It's not the Swedish problem; it's a global problem. So we are not alone, and I think WEAll is kind of something growing from underneath. People can go together, and when we met in Katrineholm, I said perhaps WEAll can get to be the United Nations that never became the people's organization. It could be the organization that United Nations never became, because it's a lot of organization in that. So now I'm ready.
Yeah. You got a comment, Amanda, to all this, all that's been said so far?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, really love that point, like about the importance of not only looking into the future, but also always thinking about history and like how we got here. And actually, this was what I was going to respond to Krister. I don't know if I'm saying your name correctly, right? But I feel you, and when I get down on the world, like there's this article I read, and it's by Howard Zinn, who's an historian, and it's called The Optimism of Uncertainty. And it's just a short article, so if people have time to read it, but it talks about how we tend to take our look at our existing systems and assume that they're going to continue on into perpetuity. But when you read history, like anything but is true, that in the face of against all odds and power and bombs and money and whatnot, like groups of people have transformed, like systems on the basis of their vision and their joy and their commitment, right? And so within WEAll's mission, I think this is significant as well. Like this is why hubs exist. This is why we are all about building the power bases. Yeah. So it's like the mass movement that is really needed to shift this paradigm and system, because we don't think it's going to come from just top down, like sort of mechanisms. Now, when there is political will, then I think it's important to also utilize that as well. But I think the idea being that this has to be a coming together of people from across silo spaces, areas to really like push for this together. And I think that's, like in similar sort of line to what you're saying as well. And because it is like now we're at a point where it really is a global issue, right? Like we're in this together, whether we like it or not. And so we really have to find the mechanisms by which to, create space for greater self-determination once again at all of the other levels. in our society.
Amanda, could you tell again the name of the article? I'm really inspired by Howard Zinn, but what was the name of the article?
It's called The Optimism of Uncertainty, and I've just put it in the chat as well.
All right.
So there's a link there for it if you want to read it afterwards.
I thought I'd let Mats in as well, because he said he had a question a little while back. So Mats, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, hi Amanda. Very interesting to hear from you. Sorry for my voice. I'm having a great. I'm sick and fever, but I want to listen to this anyhow. I have worked in a political-led organization, and on several occasions I have heard the argumentation from politicians always end up with this is good for employment and growth. It doesn't matter what it means. This is good for employment and growth. So that is repeated as an amen, or more or less, a little bit of a religion. And that have made me think, and I have tried to find out different points where to start to speak to about these things with people. And I would like to hear your comment on that, because I feel it as the neoliberal economics have been presented, and there's an image of that is completely right, and that is non-political also. So if you lift the question of and talking about other economic system, you are labeled as very political. While if you're not talking about any other kind of political economics, you are not. I mean, if you're talking about neoliberal and you support it, then you're not political. Have you reached that as well, as it's the conception of neoliberal is that it is apolitical?
Oh, first of all, Mats, I'm so sad you're sick, and I hope you feel better soon. But also, like, I could not agree with you more. Like, this has been so much of, I think, what led me to this sort of movement was, as you say, that sort of doctrine of just like growth is good, right? Like, and I've got to get to full employment, like all of these things so I'll say, like, for example, and it's crazy because in the US, that's the way it is. Like, the Democrats want to be the party of job creation, right? The same way the Republicans want to. And this whole narrative sort of trickle down economics is still so strong, even though we know it doesn't work. It's still sort of embedded within our mind that, like, we grow, like, that's what's gonna sort of save us. But one of the things that I bring up sometimes, let's say, for example, in the United States, is the majority of people here, then this is according to David Graeber, his like book Bullshit Jobs. The majority of people feel like they have a job that need not or should not exist. Yeah, like a job that they think is contributing nothing to society or actively making it worse off, right? And so the fact that we don't even consider what job, right? What the job is doing, or even the meaning or the purpose of that job, with just the fact that people have a job at all is I think part of what we're starting to see getting deconstructed a bit. So in Canada, for example, they developed a wellbeing framework recently that includes like assessing meaning and purpose, which I think is going to be really interesting, because like that's one of their top line indicators to understand, because I have a feeling that the kind of jobs that are going to provide people with the most meaning and purpose are the ones that are going to be most socially and environmentally beneficial, right? Now, maybe not, but I have, like I would say a lot of the research will show that. And I don't know if you all are aware of the Beyond Growth conference, which is happening is it in June? Yeah, next month. But the fact that that's even happening in the European Parliament, that there's a whole discussion on Beyond Growth, that they're bringing together a lot of like top academics and thinkers to challenge this logic of growth is good, is like, to me, a huge positive kind of sign. There was also, this might be useful in any of your like sort of work as well, but I found specifically for policymakers, there was a Global Commons Alliance survey that found that 74% of people in G20 countries believe that the economy should be working in a way that supports the health and well-being of people and planet, not just profit and wealth, right? And that as a like the majority of people really think that there should be a different purpose of the economy is like a really helpful starting point for people, like especially politicians and policymakers, to realize that, yeah, there's already the shift happening. People are calling for this kind of change around our North Star, or like sort of vision and progress. Now, those are the positive things, but I hear you and I share an equal frustration with a lot of the policy work I do. So if you figure it out, also please let me know, because it's yeah, the challenge.
I sometimes I feel that, well, in English you have the expression, what do you do for a living? Well, you work to live, but now it's the opposite. You live to work.
Yeah,
almost. Yeah,
absolutely.
Well, that's it. Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah.
We also had a question from oh, I don't know if you want to read it yourself, or if I should read it from our document.
Now, okay. I have to read it. I think if I find it. Is that it has disappeared from my.
Oh, if you look, sorry, I think I may have moved it to the top. I don't know if you wanted to add something. I could just read it otherwise if you can't find it.
Yeah, maybe you can read it that better.
Yes, local non-profit initiatives, for example, cooperatives, may often need some kind of financial support from larger institutions. But because of a historical lack of such organizations in Sweden, this doesn't seem to be a very important social question. So there seems to be a kind of catch-22. No financial support means very few cooperatives. Maybe some kind of in parentheses, negotiated coordination between bottom-up and top-down efforts would help. And in that case, how?
Yeah, I found it now. The question. Yeah, I think this is a very. It might be difficult, but I think if you can coordinate the changement so that you can make two things at the same time, maybe that will help to start with financial support a little, and then also start with the foundation of the smaller cooperatives, and then you have to have some communication between those levels. So how do you think one can go further with that? Okay. That's all. I think it was a simple question, but
I can answer, but I'd love to hear also if anybody else has any sort of thoughts on this too.
I was just thinking that maybe it might be very different in the US, because I think there are many more cooperatives, or like that it's quite a big, more common thing than in Sweden, maybe.
Yes, it is.
Very common compared.
And when you say cooperatives, do you mean like cooperative enterprises, or also just any sort of NGOs and like nonprofit organizations, kind of like?
Well, I would prefer nonprofit organizations of very different kinds. So like a general concept, democratic organization, nonprofit.
Yeah, but you mean companies, right? Still, like you mean like.
I mean both productive organization, and well, different kind. All of those kinds, I think, could be discussed. Could have some problem, but if you have to have, if you need very much money for it, it will be more difficult, and you have to be prepared. You have to start with organizations willing to finance organizations with very much money.
I'm just wondering if you know, I mean, that's not much money, but you know that there's this thing in Sweden that it's called microfundam, like the microfund that gives like small loans to social enterprises to start up, because like normal banks won't give it to these kinds of associations. So that's at least one way that there is to find finance right now in Sweden.
One kind of solution.
I hear you though, and I think WEAll is an example. Like, we've had this struggle, right? Like the first couple of years that WEAll Global was in existence, we were in a really bad financial situation, like near point of sort of just collapse, because where do you find money to change a system, right? That is based on particular amounts of money and thinking. And so finding financing amongst institutions that are potentially quite bought into the existing sort of system can be a challenge. But with that, again, being said, I think that because of the crises of climate change and a lot of these other kind of issues, that there's more openness now. And so there's this organization, for example, called Partners for a New Economy. And I'm getting in a little bit in the weeds, but I'm saying the point that it's a whole group of foundations that are specifically focused on system change. And so I think your point is very true, that we need to figure out how to better align, sort of like bottom up and top down. But I think sometimes I don't know enough about sort of your civil society space in Sweden, like what the strength and the composition and area, but what I'm hearing is that maybe it's a bit weaker than some other places. Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes that's also, we tend to just think about the market and the state and dichotomy, like it's either one or the other is going to take care of things. And the commons, or that like sort of third sector space, is so important, I think, for kind of the thinking outside the box and also breaking out of just sort of capitalist socialist sort of dichotomies and thinking about new ways of working together and functioning. And there's this guy, David Bollier, he wrote this book. It's really good. It's called The Commoner's Catalog for Changemakers. And it's just got a book of all of these different examples of where you're seeing different kinds of commons that are coming like together, of so where there's like citizen sort of resource governance in some way, and whether that's like a digital resource or a land resource or things like that, as that sort of third solution. And so I think that also raising awareness of those, and also recognize that a lot of times it doesn't cost money, it actually saves people a lot of money, because if you create mechanisms for, I don't know, just like freely sharing information or certain kinds of resources or things like that, like it can reduce the like costs for people, but also depending on what kind of activity it is, also even create revenue generating opportunity, right? Like depending on what good or service. And so, this is where my mind went for this question, but there's a lot that's in there, and I don't know that I've done full justice to what you were asking for as well, Bo.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of opportunities for us so we have to try different methods. Very well, yes. Okay, thank you.
So Anna wants to ask a question or a comment.
Thank you. I am very pleased because in your last minute or so you were talking about the narrative of the well-being economy, and I would like you to elaborate a little bit more, because I think many of us are very used to the vocabulary of the capitalist economy or the socialist economy or the social democratic economy that most of us here in Sweden hardly remember anymore, because even here the neoliberal economy has infested hijacked the economy, even in our public sector, in a very destructive way. So my attraction to well-being economy is the narrative, and I attended some lecture, and I'm really interested in it, in this part of the well-being economy, because I think this is how we can communicate about it to people who don't know anything about it, or if we want to communicate it to within organizations or between organizations, we need a vocabulary, we need the language. So please elaborate a little bit more on the narrative.
Sure. No, thank you so much. And I think, everything that you said was absolutely brilliant. And so love to make sure to capture that as well. Now, I should say, that like shifting narratives is a big part of sort of our theory of change. But narratives are really tricky because they're inherently fluid, and it also is all about making ideas that are going to resonate with individuals so they become their own sort of truth and can be disseminated out on the basis of that person's lived experience and knowledge, right? So this is the thing, they're transmutable and they're internalized and they're not fixed. They're not the same as messaging, if that makes sense, right? So I don't think that we've totally cracked the code here. But in terms of what you were speaking about, especially around the sort of capitalist versus socialist, how do we break out of beyond that? One of the things that I've found has worked as a way of illustrating this, it sort of comes back to Mad's point as well, is that the standard sort of story is that we need to grow the economy as quickly as possible. And within the sort of neoliberal capitalist like logic, you stop there and you just trust that it's somehow going to trickle down and make everybody better, right? And then, of course, we look at inequality nationally, globally, everything, we see that that's not the way it works. Now, within the sort of socialist, like social democratic narrative, you still grow the economy as quickly as possible, but so you can take some of that wealth through taxes to fix the damages that were done to people and planet in the process, right? And so the idea for a well-being economy is sort of the third way, where you're actually moving upstream and you're trying to think about how do you build an economic system that's already equitable and regenerative and sustainable by design, right? So that you're not constantly just after the fact, like trying to put out those fires or fix those issues. And so when we think about building like an inclusive or equitable economy, I think coming also back to Bo's point, we know that like cooperatives or social enterprises or not-for-profit like sort of institutions like will ensure a more equitable distribution of wealth or power or voice, like sort of first time around, because of that sort of organizational design. Or in terms of building like a regenerative economy, like thinking about the kind of activities, not only like circular economy of, like removing the systems that already maintain like planned obsolescence and huge amounts of pollution and waste, but also encouraging and rewarding regenerative agriculture and rewilding and like initiatives that are actually giving back more than they're taking to our natural environment. And so these kind of ideas, I guess, are sort of at the heart of the well-being economy narrative. But I think when Anders was speaking earlier, what I have to say is that what's important to us is also a recognition that it's not like it's not a one size fits all kind of model, right? Like it's not going to say like across all space and time, this is the way that it's going to look, and that there's a lot of different ideas and initiatives that are a part of this and that will make sense in different contexts. Because I think it was Anne that was saying that point around culture. I think that this is huge as well. Because if we talk about the economy as the way we produce and provide for one another, that's always going to be influenced by our culture and our geography, our history, our policies, and a lot of other factors. And so the shape and form of the economic system that will work best for you in line with your values and your priorities, like has to be a reflection, and similarly the journey to get there. So this is why it's great that, you know, like I can learn from you and like your sort of hub experiences to help inform like the work we're doing here in Vermont in the US and vice versa. But ultimately, like the idea being that we'll get back to having more locally embedded like economies that are connected, obviously across space, but reflections of our unique cultures as well.
Really inspiring, kind of almost conclusion to this discussion.
Thank you.
Um,
Thank you very much.
I can ask the question, Amanda.
Yeah, go for it.
I was thinking of, even though there is no one size fits all, what do you consider inspiring really different alternative economic models? Are there any?
Mm-hmm. I think there's tons, actually, you know, so I mean, we talk a lot about there's like donut economics and solidarity economy. There's like post-growth and degrowth. There's economy for the common good, regenerative economy, circular economy. I think the core economy is really important. Like that's where you really think about that non-monetary like aspects of life between like friends and neighbors, and like sort of that the ways that we provide for one another out of motivations of love and sort of responsibility. Yeah, I think there's a lot out there, and again, I think they all provide us important pieces and frames by which to think about this alternative system. I think some are more theoretical than others, like some like have their different applications. And so like community wealth building and circular economy, for example, I think are a lot more practical, right? Like they really get into starting to be about like the nitty gritty of like what does this mean in terms of really different methods for connecting different kind of economic activities or institutions in a place and different forms of production. And whereas, you know, tools like donut economics really help us to evaluate our economy in a very different way in terms of its contribution to our social or like goals, whilst respecting planetary boundaries. And so I think they all come in at their different points. And I think, you know, it's people, I don't know, what is the one that resonates with you most, Anders? Like, what's your sort of favorite model, economic model or theory?
To me, I'm very inspired by ideas that are quite hands-on how we in the future could make decisions of what research to use now or later and how to distribute resources. And with resources, that means both labor and land and of course, nature as a product from nature, or material from nature. And in that matter, I find participatory economics really inspiring, also because it's such a completely different society. So getting to know that kind of different even universe somehow, a way of thinking, is kind of making for me a new reference point in understanding life. And that's to me a very good starting point to kind of see where we are from outside. Even though as you say, Amanda, I'm quite sure that we need to, from place to place and with different cultures and so, we need to start from different points. But that's a really, to me, inspiring kind of model. And I think that those kind of models I would like very much to see more of. Than just most this and that economy alternatives for me is too vague to be to that I can see it's in a kind of useful sense.
No, I love that. And I do like this comes up a lot, especially because I work at sort of the intersection of policy and economics, because I think that the crises of democracy are fundamentally interconnected with the economic crises we face. And so I was speaking with a woman from the OECD like a couple months ago, and she was talking about how she was doing research on participatory, deliberative, democratic kind of initiatives from across the OECD countries for the past 50 years. And she was saying the last couple of years, it's been exponential. Yeah, like people are calling for a change in terms of the mechanisms of decision making and calling to have a voice. And so these two things are fundamentally interconnected. And so I think participatory economics for me like is very, very resonant because it does, right? Like ultimately the system has to be a reflection of people's deliberate discussion and decision making, right? Like that it is always going to be a reflection of our priorities and of our decisions. And so I don't know, I mean, you probably have already seen this, but I'm going to share it in the chat as well, our Wellbeing Economy Policy Design Guide, because it's all about like, how do we redesign the system through participatory methods of, you know, creating new visions and going through processes of, redefinition. And I mean, I know that Citizens Assembly, like it should be really like community discussion, like sort of forums and spaces, but the recent Citizens Assembly in Spain on climate, I don't know if you've seen this, but it was pretty cool because the recommendations they came up with were all like circular economy, regenerative economy, like green building infrastructure, right? Like as soon as you start with the higher level goals, people come up with, they recognize that the economic system is what needs to change.
Yeah.
And so I just have total trust that if we really created genuine participatory methods for people to lead this transformation, that we would get there quickly. Also maybe coming back to,
and that maybe brings us back to the question that Krister earlier asked about getting attention. And
a really interesting conversation here about just formally we've kind of come to the end of the webinar, but I also wanted to ask Amanda, do you need to leave or would you like to stay on for a little bit longer and talk?
Yeah, I can stay for a bit longer. Sorry about that. I didn't realize our time had gotten, but yeah.
Discussion is great. So like for us, like it's no issue. I mean, obviously someone needs to drop off and do, and I realize this is probably your lunch break as well.
My question wasn't about getting attention primarily. It was about how do we achieve what is needed.
And that also kind of brings me back to what, because I really want to hear a little bit about your work right now, like because I mean, I don't know, but I have a feeling that you are like working a lot on a global level, and I'm just kind of curious what's happening there, because you know I'm editing the film where you were in, and in that you in one point you're talking about like, grassroots level is of course really important, etc. But there are also some things that just has to happen on like a global level, because there are just some global legislation that just makes it really, really difficult for local places to have power over their own economy. So I was just wondering if you could give us any like what is happening right now, like in the global space, kind of questions.
Absolutely, yeah. So we've started this sort of global, very early stages, but specifically around this point around how can we work to sort of re-envision and transform our global economic sort of architecture? And one of the things that we're clear on is that it really needs to start from really centering like Indigenous and majority world voices and perspectives, in terms of what connects us across space and time in this earth, right? And how can we sort of provide for one another, produce and provide for one another in a way that is really in balance and harmony with our social and ecological sort of needs and systems. And so our hope is, one of the things we noticed is that whenever you talk about the global economic system, I think because it's so big, but also we fall back on very traditional categories and silos, right? So we say, the trade system is broken, so let's reform the trade system, right? Or let's reform the financial system or the, debt or whatnot. And all of those are important, of course, but I think we have a unique opportunity right now where, in the same way that after the financial crisis, like it took a little while for it to percolate in and lead to this renaissance in new economic thinking, I think the fundamental failure of us to develop any globally coordinated response to COVID or to the climate crisis for that matter is also percolating in and is going to lead to a renaissance, I think, in terms of global governance thinking and initiatives in the coming, I don't know, hopefully soon, but maybe at least decades, right? And so taking time to create a very bold, radical, and hopeful vision for our global economic system that can be a starting point for us then to look at, okay, well, what are the existing global networks or initiatives that we see as actually in line or working towards that vision? And what are the ones that we see as really like constraining or problematic in terms of achieving that vision, as then being foundations for a set of reforms that then will bring in to a global members assembly, right? So we're going to want to invite everybody to a sort of global, sort of like a citizens assembly, but like for our global membership, to then go through a process of dialogue around this as well, and to identify the priority like campaigns or reforms or initiatives that we really think that we can best like bring our different skills and networks and values to invoke change around in solidarity with the world, because the reality is that our network is still predominantly global north. And so I think it's important for us to like utilize that power and the influence we do have in this system, sort of push for those reforms that are needed to begin to make space, right, for the other kind of transformations. And so I can't say exactly what this vision will look like, but I feel like if we're not questioning even nation states, right, like we're not going big enough, right? Like, and so I'm really hoping for something that's quite, a very different vision of how we might be structuring our economic system in the world, like global economic system, and then that as a starting point for more concrete sort of collective action and an opportunity for us to all be working in our place. And I think that's important, but also find something common by which to align efforts to.
Thank you. I don't know what you say, other Amanda. Should we wrap this up now, maybe?
Well, thank you so much, Amanda, for joining us and sharing your story and all the knowledge from WEAll Global, but also the Vermont hub. It's great to be part of this network, to hear so many stories, and we're going to keep inviting people from different places, I think, just so we can have this conversation going between countries, because even though, as you say, like local resilience and questions that they're really important, it's also really important to always have this global outlook, I think. Thank you very much for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure to connect with you all. I hope you have a great weekend ahead, and I look forward to reconnecting again soon.
You too.
Thank you, everybody.
Just want to say
quick
information just before we finish that we are going to have May 9th is the next hubs gathering for the Swedish hub, but then we won't do a webinar. It will just be more focused on just these discussions between people. So we haven't decided exactly what topics we want to talk about, but I'm sure we're going to have breakout rooms where people can engage with each other and share their ideas. So just check out our social media with WEAll Sweden. You will find we will put out the event soon. So there you're very welcome to come and discuss with us May 9th. Yeah, I just wanted to say that quickly.
Thanks for remembering that. So yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining. It's really great conversation.
All right.